Claire Whitmore dropped the invoice on the table like it was trash. $450. She said it out loud slowly, so every executive in that room could feel how ridiculous it was. We are holding up a $650 million shipment for this. She didn't wait for an answer. She picked up her phone, dialed facilities, and canceled Andre Lawson's contract in less than 90 seconds while he was still standing in the room. Andre said nothing. He placed his report on the table, laid his badge beside it, and walked out. He already knew what Claire Whitmore did not. The fractures were already there. The clock was already running. And in 72 hours, the most expensive mistake of her career would arrive not in a boardroom, but in a federal laboratory. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The elevator doors opened on the 38th floor at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, and Andre Lawson stepped out carrying a manila folder, a laptop bag worn thin at the strap, and 31 years of precision engineering in his hands. He was not dressed the way people on that floor dressed. No tailored suit. No pocket square. No lanyard with a title that announced his importance before he opened his mouth. He had on clean dark trousers, a collared shirt pressed tight enough that you could tell he'd done it himself, and work boots, the real kind, the kind with scuff marks along the toe from actual factory floors. He was 46 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of physical work, with close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, and eyes that had the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades looking for things other people missed. The receptionist at the executive desk looked up, looked him over, looked back at her screen. "Can I help you?" "Andre Lawson, I have a 9:45 with Ms. Whitmore." She typed something, typed it again. "You're the contractor?" "Yes, ma'am." She picked up her phone, murmured something into it, and then gestured toward a row of chairs with the same energy she might use to direct a delivery driver. "Someone will be right out." Andre sat. He opened his folder. He went over his numbers one more time, not because he didn't know them, but because he was a man who believed that precision was a form of respect. You showed up with your work done. You showed up ready. He had been ready since 4 o'clock that morning. The night before had started with a phone call from Raul Bennett at 6:18 p.m. Andre had been standing at his kitchen counter, finishing the dishes. His daughter Maya's backpack sitting by the door for school the next day, a half-eaten plate of rice and chicken on the table that he'd been meaning to wrap up. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. "Is this Andre Lawson, the materials engineer?" "Speaking. My name is Raul Bennett. I'm the plant manager at Arden Aeronautics Facility 7. I got your name from Marcus Webb at Lockheed. He said you were the person to call when something doesn't make sense, and the machines say everything's fine." Andre dried his hands. "What's not making sense? A vibration pattern. Shows up only after the line's been running 4 or 5 hours. Intermittent. My engineers can't replicate it in testing. The automated systems aren't flagging anything. Management says I'm chasing ghosts." "What are you producing on that line?" A pause. "Flight control units. For a federal contract." Andre was quiet for a moment. "What's the contract size?" $650 million. He looked at the plate of food on the table. He looked at Maya's backpack. He thought about what his ex-wife used to say, that he cared more about broken machinery than broken relationships. She wasn't entirely wrong. But she also didn't understand that when you spent 6 years in the United States Air Force running materials integrity for jet components, broken machinery wasn't an abstraction. It was a casket. It was a folded flag. It was somebody's son not coming home. "When do you need me?" "Tonight if possible. I can authorize $450 from the maintenance budget. I know it's not. I'll be there at 10. Raul exhaled. "Thank you. And Mr. Lawson, I need you to know that this is unofficial. My supervisor doesn't know I'm making this call. If you find something and my management doesn't want to hear it. Let's see what I find first." He arrived at Facility 7 at 9:58 p.m. 2 minutes early, because Andre Lawson was always 2 minutes early. Raul met him at the security entrance, a compact man in his late 40s, dark circles under his eyes, the look of someone who hadn't slept well in days. He shook Andre's hand with both of his. I appreciate you coming, I really do. Walk me through what you've got. They went to the production floor. It was running at reduced capacity that night, a skeleton crew doing overnight quality checks, machinery humming in that steady mechanical rhythm that experienced engineers can read like a heartbeat. Andre stood still at the edge of the floor and just listened for 2 full minutes without saying anything. Raul waited. How long has the line been running tonight? About 3 hours. I need it to run 2 more before we'll hear it. They went to the break room. Raul got coffee. Andre declined. He opened his laptop and started reviewing the production logs, the maintenance records, the materials specifications for the cleaning protocol. He read slowly the way men read when they are looking for a lie. He found one 40 minutes later, not in the machinery, in the materials log. When did you switch solvents? Raul looked up from his coffee. About 6 weeks ago. COO signed off on it. Cheaper alternative, same rated specification according to the supplier. Same rated spec for what temperature range? Raul frowned. Standard operating range. Same as always. But these units cycle up past standard operating range during thermal stress testing. They're flight control components. They have to survive temperature extremes. Right. Has anyone tested the new solvent's residue behavior at sustained high temperature? Not the solvent itself, the residue it leaves on the alloy coating after it evaporates. Raul stared at him. I don't know. Andre was already typing. He pulled up the chemical composition data for the new solvent. It was publicly available from this manufacturer, buried in a technical safety sheet that most people skipped past. He pulled up the alloy specification for the coating used on the flight control units. He opened a thermal interaction table from an engineering database he subscribed to at his own expense every year. It took him 11 minutes to see it. The solvent left a residue, barely detectable, essentially invisible to the naked eye, harmless at normal temperatures. But at sustained thermal cycling, the kind these components experienced in realistic flight conditions, that residue began breaking down the bonding layer between the protective coating and the base alloy. Not all at once. Slowly. Over repeated cycles. Like water working its way into a crack in concrete over years. The parts would pass every standard inspection. They would look perfect. They would measure perfect. And then somewhere above 30,000 feet after enough heat cycles, microscopic fractures would form in the coating. In a best-case scenario, that meant component degradation and eventually failure requiring ground maintenance. In a worst-case scenario, Andre closed that thought. He didn't need to finish it to know what it meant. He stood up. I need to see the floor now. The vibration was there exactly as Raul had described it. A faint harmonic, almost subliminal, presenting only in the units that had been processed with the new solvent and run through enough thermal cycles to begin showing the early stress signature. It wasn't random noise. It was structural. It was the sound of something being slowly destroyed by a decision somebody made in a boardroom to save money on cleaning chemicals. Andre spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. He pulled 4 units off the line with Raul's authorization and examined their coatings under magnification. He photographed what he found. He ran his own chemical residue test with a field kit he kept in his bag. He wrote up his preliminary findings in his clearest technical language, the language he'd been trained to use when the Air Force needed reports that a general could read and a court could understand. At 3:15 a.m. he sealed 2 of the affected units in labeled evidence bags and handed them to Raul. These need to go to an independent laboratory first thing this morning. Not Arden's internal lab. Independent. I'll give you the name of the one I use. What are you finding? Andre looked at him steadily. I'm finding what you were afraid you'd find. The vibration is real. The cause is the solvent change. The affected units will pass standard inspection, which means if they ship... He stopped. I need to present this to your executive leadership today. Who do I report to? Raul's jaw tightened. Technically, my chain of command goes through Grant Mercer, the COO. The same man who authorized the solvent change. Silence. Yes. Andre nodded slowly. Then we need to go to the top. I need to present directly to your CEO. Raul rubbed his face. Mr. Lawson, I have to warn you, Claire Whitmore is... She's very focused on the production schedule right now. The contract deadline is in 72 hours. She's not going to want to hear... She needs to hear it whether she wants to or not. That's not a preference, that's a safety imperative. Can you get me in front of her? I can try. Try hard, Raul, because when I say this is serious, I mean... I know what you mean. Raul's voice was quiet. I've been a plant manager for 19 years. I know what a real problem sounds like. That's why I called you. Andre put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder. Then let's make sure the right people hear it. He drove home as the sun came up, showered, made breakfast for Maya, sat at the kitchen table while she ate her cereal, and talked about a project she had due on Friday, about the water cycle. He listened. He asked questions. He braided her hair the way her mother used to. He'd learned by watching YouTube videos 2 years ago when he realized nobody else was going to do it and drove her to school. Then he went back to his desk and finished the full report. It was 11 pages. Diagrams, chemical analysis, photograph documentation, technical literature, citations, the full thermal interaction model, and a precise repair recommendation. Halt production switch, back to the original solvent. Implement a retroactive testing protocol for all units produced in the last 6 weeks, and do not ship until every affected component had been cleared. Estimated downtime, 36 hours. He emailed it to Raul at 8:22 a.m. By 9:15, Raul had managed to get Andre a 9:45 appointment with the CEO. By 9:47, Andre was stepping off the elevator on the 38th floor. He waited 22 minutes before anyone came to get him. The man who eventually appeared at the reception desk was wearing a suit that cost more than Andre's monthly rent, and carrying the particular expression of someone who has been assigned a task they consider beneath them. He introduced himself as Kevin, an executive assistant, and led Andre down a hallway past glass-walled conference rooms where people in expensive clothes had important conversations. They stopped outside a set of double doors. Ms. Whitmore has about 10 minutes, Kevin said in the tone that translated to, "Don't expect more than that. I'll need at least 25. Kevin looked at him. 10 minutes, sir. Andre didn't argue. He followed Kevin through the double doors. Claire Whitmore was standing with her back to the door when he entered, looking at something on her phone. She was in her late 50s, immaculately composed, tailored blazer hair that had been done that morning. Heels that said she had never once spent a night on a factory floor. She had the self-possessed quality of someone who had spent 30 years ensuring that every room she entered understood who was in charge. She turned when the door opened, glanced at Andre, and then looked at Kevin with an expression that lasted less than a second, but communicated everything. "This is the contractor, Mr. Lawson." She did not extend her hand. "I understand you've been brought in by plant operations. Please." She gestured at a chair not at the main conference table, but at a smaller side chair, the kind used for assistants and note-takers. "Walk me through what you found." Andre did not sit in the side chair. He moved to the conference table, set his folder down, and opened his laptop. "Ms. Whitmore, I'll be direct with you because I think you're someone who prefers directness. I was hired to investigate an anomalous vibration pattern on your flight control line 7. What I found is more serious than a vibration. You have a materials contamination issue caused by your new industrial solvent, interacting with the alloy coating on your flight control units in ways that aren't visible under standard inspection protocols, but will produce structural fractures under realistic thermal cycling conditions. Claire's expression didn't change. Our quality reports are showing green across all parameters. Yes, they would. The defect I'm describing won't be caught by your standard inspection, because it presents after sustained thermal cycling conditions. Your QC protocol doesn't replicate at sufficient duration. The fractures are microscopic and subsurface. They're there. I have documentation. He turned his laptop toward her. This is the chemical interaction analysis. This, he slid a photograph across the table, is what I observed under magnification on 4 units I pulled from your line last night. This is the comparison with the original solvent's residue behavior. And this is the projected failure window based on standard flight thermal cycle data. Claire looked at the laptop. She looked at the photograph. Then she looked at Andre. Who authorized you to pull units from the line? Your plant manager. Raul Bennett doesn't have authority to. Ms. Whitmore, I need to ask you to look at this data before we discuss chain of command questions. The temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. Kevin, standing near the door, became very still. Claire set her phone face down on the table, slowly, deliberately, and folded her hands. Mr. Lawson, let me make sure I understand the situation. You were hired for a $450 inspection. You worked one night. And you are now telling me that based on one night's observation, I should halt production on a $650 million federal contract shipment that is due in 72 hours. Yes, ma'am. That is exactly what I'm telling you. Based on a vibration. Based on a documented chemical interaction causing progressive structural degradation in flight critical components. The vibration was the symptom that led me to the cause. The cause is what I'm presenting to you now. She looked at him for a long moment. The look was not angry exactly. It was something more refined than anger. It was the look of a person who had made a decision before they walked into the room and was waiting for the other party to finish talking so they could deliver it. Mr. Lawson. Her voice was measured, patient in the way that is not actually patient. We have automated quality systems that run continuous diagnostics. We have a 12-person internal engineering team. We have a federal inspector scheduled to do a pre-shipment review. And we have 30 years of operational excellence in this facility. Now I appreciate that you've worked hard on this. She glanced at his folder without touching it. But I think what you may be seeing is noise in an aging system that our internal team has already accounted for. Have you spoken with your internal team about the solvent change? My COO manages operational procurement decisions. Has your COO reviewed the chemical interaction data between the new solvent and your alloy coating specification? A fractional pause. That's not. Because if he had, I believe this shipment would already be on hold. The pause was longer this time. Are you suggesting that my COO is incompetent? I'm suggesting that a chemical interaction table in a technical safety specification is easy to miss if you're not looking for it. I'm not assigning blame. I'm describing what the data shows. Ms. Whitmore. He leaned forward slightly. These are flight control units. They go into aircraft. I need you to take these findings seriously. She stood up. That was it. That was the signal. Andre had seen it before, not often, but enough. The moment when a powerful person in a room decides that the conversation is no longer happening. We are not delaying a $650 million shipment based on a $450 theory from a one-night contractor. There it was. 7 seconds of pure silence. Andre looked at her. He thought about the photograph. He thought about the fracture model. He thought about what those units were going to go into. He thought about the men and women who would eventually be sitting in whatever aircraft those flight control units were installed in. He closed his laptop. He capped his pen. He stacked his papers with the same deliberate calm he'd had at 4 o'clock that morning. He picked up his access badge from the table where he'd placed it when he sat down. Then he held it out. Ms. Whitmore, I've submitted my complete findings in writing to you, to your quality control director, and to your legal counsel. The documentation is time-stamped and detailed. 2 affected sample units have been delivered to an independent laboratory for third-party testing. I have done everything within my professional capacity to ensure that this company has the information it needs. He placed the badge on the table. The rest is up to you. He picked up his laptop bag. He picked up his folder. He buttoned his jacket. And then Andre Lawson walked out of the conference room on the 38th floor of Arden Aeronautics through the hallway, past the glass-walled rooms into the elevator, and down to the lobby, while Claire Whitmore stood at the head of her conference table and said nothing. Kevin looked at the badge on the table. He looked at the door. He looked at Claire. She was already picking up her phone. Stunning. By the time Andre reached his car in the parking structure, he had already forwarded his complete report to 3 additional parties. The Federal Contracting Officer's Administrative Office, whose name he'd found in Arden's publicly listed contract documentation, an aviation safety advocacy organization he'd worked with twice before, and his own attorney. He was not doing this to retaliate. Howe was doing it because he understood with the cold clarity of 31 years of materials engineering what was going to happen next. He sat in his car for a moment. He looked at his phone. There was a text from Maya, a heart emoji, and a message that said, "How did the work thing go, Dad?" He stared at it for a second. Then he typed back, "Good baby. Be home for dinner." He started the car. He did not look back at the building. What he left behind in that conference room was not just a badge and a folder. It was a complete documented time-stamped record of a defect that was going to find its way to the surface, whether Claire Whitmore wanted it to or not. The question was never if. The question was always when, and whether when it arrived anyone would still be in a position to minimize the damage. He had given her every tool she needed to avoid the disaster. She had handed him back the tools and shown him the door. Inside Arden Aeronautics, the production line on Floor 7 continued to run. Grant Mercer, Chief Operating Officer, received a forwarded summary of Andre's visit from Kevin by 10:20 a.m. He read it in his office with his door closed and his blinds angled shut. He read the part about the chemical interaction model. He read the part about the alloy coating degradation. He read the part about the independent laboratory samples. Then he picked up his phone. Not to call the quality team. Not to call legal counsel. Not to call Claire. He called his assistant and told her to pull Andre Lawson's preliminary report out of the executive distribution list and reroute it to a secondary review folder that was for all practical purposes a dead end. A digital filing cabinet that received documents and generated no action. Then he opened his email and composed a message to Claire. Regarding this morning's contractor visit, I've reviewed the concern. The individual appears to have some field experience, but is working from incomplete data and appears to have misunderstood our QC protocols. I've asked our internal team to take a second look at the line, but based on our continuous monitoring systems, I see no basis for altering the production schedule. Recommend we proceed on timeline. He read it over once. He hit send. He swiveled his chair toward his window and looked out at the parking structure below, where a man in clean dark trousers and work boots was pulling out of the lot in a 9-year-old pickup truck. Grant Mercer watched the truck until it was gone. Then he turned back to his desk. By noon, 3 people inside Arden Aeronautics had received Andre's full 11-page report via email. The quality control director, whose name was listed on the internal distribution chain, the company's general legal counsel, and Claire Whitmore herself directly a second time because Andre believed that important information should be delivered more than once when the stakes were high enough. The quality control director's email bounced back with an auto-reply, "I am out of office through Thursday. For urgent matters, please contact Grant Mercer's office." The general legal counsel's paralegal flagged the email as an unsolicited vendor communication and moved it to a tertiary review queue. Claire's copy landed in her inbox at 11:53 a.m. She was in a production review meeting with 5 senior managers going over the shipping timeline. Her phone showed the notification. She saw Andre's name. She kept talking about the timeline. By 2:00 p.m., she had not opened it. By 5:00 p.m., the email had been read not by Claire, but by her executive assistant, who scanned it, marked it as contractor report, pending internal review, and moved it to a folder labeled Vendor Communications. By the time Andre drove home that evening, made dinner for Maya, helped her finish the water cycle project, and sat in his living room with the quiet that comes when a house goes to sleep, and a father is left alone with what he knows. By that time, every warning he had issued was sitting in a digital drawer somewhere inside Arden Aeronautics unseen. But the samples were already at the independent laboratory, and the fractures were already there, silent and invisible and patient inside the flight control units on their way to being packed into shipping containers for a $650 million federal contract. And Andre Lawson, sitting alone in his living room at 11 o'clock at night with a cup of coffee. Gone cold, knew with the particular grief of a man who has done everything right and still could not make someone listen, that what happened next was already written. He had just done everything in his power to change the ending. The question was whether the ending would change before anyone else paid the price for it. I thought about something his crew chief used to say back in the Air Force at Ramstein Air Base in Germany when young engineers came to him frustrated that their concerns weren't being taken seriously by senior command. The chief's name was Wallace. Master Sergeant Earl Wallace from outside Birmingham, Alabama, who had 30 years in and had seen things that made his jaw set in a permanent kind of quiet determination. Son, Wallace used to say, your job is not to make people listen. Your job is to make sure the record is clean. You put it in writing. You send it to everybody who needs to know. You document what you found and when you found it and what you recommended. And then, if they still don't listen, at least you know that when the truth comes out, and it always comes out, nobody can say they didn't know. Andre had spent 30 years doing exactly that. He pulled out his notepad and wrote one more time by hand what he had found, what he had submitted, who he had sent it to, and the date and time of his independent laboratory drop-off. Then he signed it. He put it in the manila folder with everything else. He clipped the folder shut and placed it on his desk where he would know where to find it when the phone rang. Because the phone was going to ring. It always did. He went to bed at 11:47 p.m. He slept the deep sleep of a man who has nothing to be ashamed of. 3 days later the phone rang. The phone on Grant Mercer's desk rang at 6:47 in the morning, 2 days after Andre Lawson walked out of that conference room. Grant let it ring twice before he picked up. We have a problem. It was Kevin Clare's executive assistant, and the fact that Kevin was calling Grant directly at 6:47 a.m. instead of routing through the normal chain, told Grant everything he needed to know about the temperature of the situation before Kevin said another word. The Federal Contracting Office sent a pre-inspection notice. Rebecca Shaw's team is coming in 48 hours instead of 72. They moved the timeline up. Grant's jaw tightened. Why? They didn't give a reason. They never do. Grant set his coffee down. Does Claire know? She's being briefed right now. All right, keep me posted. He hung up. He sat at his desk for a long moment, very still, the way a man sits when he's running calculations in his head that he doesn't want anyone else to see. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up the secondary review folder where Andre Lawson's report had been rerouted 48 hours earlier. 11 pages. Diagrams. Chemical analysis. Photographs. A thermal interaction model that Grant had studied in engineering school 25 years ago and recognized immediately when he first skimmed it. He had known from the moment he read the summary. Kevin forwarded him the morning of Andre's visit that the report was not the work of a man chasing ghosts. He had known it was the work of someone who understood materials engineering at a level that made Grant's own background look decorative by comparison. He had buried it anyway, because the alternative, admitting that the solvent he had personally approved the cost-cutting measure he had championed in 3 consecutive budget meetings. The decision that had saved Arden Aeronautics $340,000 in procurement costs had introduced a defect into $650 million worth of flight-critical components was not something Grant Mercer was prepared to do. Not to Claire. Not to the board. Not to anyone. He closed the folder. He picked up his phone and called his procurement director. The Halcyon solvent contract, I need you to pull the approval documentation and make sure everything is filed under standard operational review. All of it. Today. Is there an issue with, just file it, today? He hung up. He sat back. 48 hours. Rebecca Shaw's team in 48 hours. Grant ran the timeline in his head. The units were already through final packaging. The shipping manifests were being processed. If the inspection was clean, and it should be clean because the standard inspection protocol wouldn't catch what Andre had described, then the shipment would clear, the contract would be fulfilled, and whatever microscopic interaction was happening inside those alloy coatings would become someone else's problem, somewhere down the line, long after the payment had cleared and the quarterly numbers had been reported. He almost believed it. Almost. Because there was one variable he hadn't fully accounted for: the independent laboratory. Andre had specified when he handed the 2 sample units to Raul on the night of his inspection that they go to Meridian Technical Services, a third-party materials testing lab based 30 miles outside the city, used primarily by defense contractors and aerospace companies who needed results that could withstand legal scrutiny. He'd used Meridian twice before on separate engagements, and he trusted their methodology because their methodology was bulletproof. What Andre had not told Raul, because Raul hadn't needed to know, was that he'd also called Meridian directly from his car at 4:30 a.m. on the morning after his inspection and spoken to their overnight intake coordinator. I need a rush thermal cycling analysis on 2 aerospace components: materials coating integrity residue interaction, fracture propagation modeling, under sustained high-temp cycling. How fast can you turn that around? Standard rush is 5 business days. I need it in 48 hours. A pause. That's an emergency rate. I know. Bill me at the emergency rate. Can I ask what application these components are for? Flight control, federal contract. Another pause longer this time. We'll start intake at 7 a.m. when the lab opens. Can you have someone deliver them by then? They'll be there. He'd called Raul back at 4:37 a.m. and given him the address and the time window. Raul, who was still at the plant, finishing his own overnight documentation, had driven the samples to Meridian himself, arriving at 6:52 a.m. with 2 sealed evidence bags and the requisition form Andre had prepared. The lab had started their analysis that morning. By the second evening, the same evening, Grant Mercer was restructuring his procurement paperwork, and Kevin was telling Claire that the federal inspection had moved up. Meridian's lead analyst had completed the first phase of the thermal cycling test. Her name was Dr. Patricia Osei. She had a doctorate in materials science from Georgia Tech and 17 years of aerospace testing experience. She ran the test twice because she wanted to be certain before she wrote her preliminary notes. Then she called her supervisor. "You need to come look at this." Raul Bennett had not slept well in 4 days. He sat in the plant manager's office, a windowed box overlooking the production floor, and watched the overnight crew running final packaging on the units that were scheduled to ship in 36 hours. He watched the workers moving between stations with the practiced efficiency of people who did this every day and trusted that someone above them had made sure it was safe. He watched the conveyor systems and the quality check stations and the automated scanners that ran diagnostics and showed green across every parameter. And he thought about Andre Lawson standing on this floor at 3 in the morning, holding a photograph saying, "I'm finding what you were afraid you'd find." Raul's desk phone rang. Bennett. It was one of his floor supervisors calling from the packaging station. "Hey Raul, I got a weird one. 2 of the units we logged for the federal shipment are showing as signed out on the materials tracking system, but they're not in the packaging inventory. You know anything about that?" Raul knew exactly what that was. Those were Andre's samples. He'd logged them out himself under a maintenance review code before driving them to Meridian. "Those are accounted for. They're an external review. Don't flag them on the shipment manifest, log them as pending return." "Okay. You want me to tell Grant's office?" Raul's hand tightened on the phone. "No, I'll handle it." He hung up. He sat for a moment. Then he picked the phone back up and dialed a number he'd saved in his personal cell, not his work phone, the morning after Andre had left. Andre answered on the second ring. "Raul." "They moved the federal inspection up. 48 hours. A beat of silence. "How far along is Meridian?" "I don't know. I haven't heard from them." "I'll call them." "Andre." Raul stopped. "Grant Mercer is running something. I don't know exactly what, but his assistant has been in the records room twice today pulling procurement files. Something's getting cleaned up." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Raul almost said something to fill it. "Okay," Andre said finally. "Okay, let me make some calls. Raul, listen to me, do not put anything in writing through your company email right now. Nothing. You understand me?" "Yeah. If anyone asks you about the samples, you tell the truth. You authorized a maintenance review per your standard operating authority. That's accurate. That's all you say." "What about you? If they come after you?" "Let them." Raul heard something in those 2 words that settled him slightly. Not confidence exactly, but something more solid. The composure of a man who had already played out the scenarios and decided he could live with all of them. "Andre, I'm sorry I got you into this. You didn't get me into anything. You called me because you had a real problem, and you needed someone who could look at it honestly. I made my own choices from there. Don't carry that." Raul sat back in his chair. Through the window, the overnight crew kept working, kept packaging, kept moving units toward a shipment date that was getting closer by the hour. Those units, Raul said quietly, the ones on that floor right now, if they ship, I know. How bad is it, honestly? A pause. When Andre spoke, his voice was careful and specific, the voice of a man who had been asked for the truth and intended to give it exactly. Under normal operational conditions, you might not see failure for 6 to 18 months, maybe longer, but under high-stress thermal cycling, the kind that happens during demanding flight conditions, you could see coating fracture propagation within 90 days of sustained deployment. Once it starts, it accelerates. You get component degradation, loss of precision in the flight control response, and depending on the specific installation and flight profile. He stopped. It's not survivable, in a worst-case scenario. Raul's eyes closed. Then we have to stop this shipment. Yes, Andre said. We do. But I can't stop it from where I'm sitting. The only people who can stop it are inside that building. And right now, the people with the authority to stop it are the same people who have decided they don't want to know. Claire Whitmore had not thought about Andre Lawson since the morning he walked out of her conference room. That was not entirely true, and she knew it. She had thought about him twice, both times dismissively, in the internal shorthand she used to file away situations she'd already resolved. The contractor. The $450 complaint. Handled. What she had not done was open his email. It was still there. She didn't know that she didn't track her own inbox at that level of granularity. She had people for that. But it was there, sitting in the vendor communications folder, 11 pages of documentation that described with clinical precision exactly what was wrong with her production line and exactly what would happen if she shipped without fixing it. She was in her office at 7:15 a.m., reviewing the updated federal inspection timeline with her head of operations when her assistant knocked and entered. I'm sorry to interrupt. Dr. Leonard from the Quality Assurance Division is asking to see you. He says it's urgent. Claire looked at her operations director. Is this about the inspection prep? It shouldn't be. We went through everything yesterday. The QA checklist is complete. Send him in. Dr. Leonard was 53 years old, had been with Arden for 11 years, and was the kind of man who wore the same brand of khaki pants every day of his life, and would rather be right than liked. He came in without sitting down. I need to talk to you about something that's been flagged in the system. Go ahead. A contractor filed an external materials report 4 days ago. It was rerouted before it reached my desk. I found it this morning in a secondary archive folder when I was doing pre-inspection documentation review. Ms. Whitmore. He put a printed copy on her desk. I've had 30 minutes with this report. 30 minutes. And I'm telling you right now, this is not noise. Claire looked at the document. She looked at the name at the top. Andre Lawson, Materials Engineer. Dr. Leonard. This was reviewed by the COO's office and determined to be, with respect, no, it was not reviewed. It was rerouted. There is a significant difference. His voice was flat and precise. The chemical interaction this man identified is real. I've run the numbers myself in the last half hour. The halcyon solvent's residue behavior under sustained thermal cycling. Above the standard range, it is a documented concern in the literature. It is not widely known because most applications don't push into that temperature range. These units do. Ms. Whitmore, if Rebecca Shaw's team runs extended thermal testing, they run standard protocol. Standard protocol is 12 hours. The fracture presentation in this model begins showing at 14. He pointed at a specific graph in the report. If they run long, we are going to fail that inspection. Silence. Claire looked at the paper. She looked at Dr. Leonard. She thought about the production timeline. She thought about the 72-hour window that had just become 48 hours. She thought about the quarterly earnings report that was due to the board in 3 weeks, and the $650 million line item that was a cornerstone of every projection she'd made. How confident are you in this assessment? Based on what I've read in 30 minutes, 70%. If I had 6 hours with the actual units and full chemical testing, I could get you to 90. We don't have 6 hours. No, we have 48. The silence stretched. Claire's operations director had gone very still. Where is this contractor now? I don't know. He was terminated 4 days ago. The word terminated sat in the room, and nobody touched it. Get me Grant, Claire said. Grant Mercer came to Claire's office 12 minutes later. He had combed his hair and straightened his tie and assembled his face into the expression of a man who had been briefed on the situation and had it under control. He did not have it under control. He recognized Dr. Leonard's copy of Andre's report the moment he walked in. He recognized it because he had read it himself twice 4 days ago. He recognized the graphs. He recognized the chemical analysis table. He recognized the photographs. He sat down. Grant. Claire's voice was quiet. Tell me about the halcyon solvent approval. It's a standard-rated replacement for the previous formulation. Same spec category, significant cost savings. I approved it through the normal operational review process. Did that review include thermal interaction testing at extended temperature ranges? A pause, half a second. The supplier certification covers the standard operating parameters. That's not what I asked. Grant's hands were flat on the table. Extended range testing was not part of the standard review protocol for a replacement solvent in that spec category. But it should have been for this application. In hindsight, Grant. She stopped him. Don't use that word with me right now. This report was filed 4 days ago. It came through the executive distribution. Why is it sitting in a secondary archive folder? Grant looked at the table. How was a man who had spent 20 years managing information, managing optics, managing the flow of bad news, so that it arrived cushioned and recontextualized and stripped of the specificity that made it genuinely alarming? He was very good at it. He had built his career on it. But he was sitting across from a woman who was not stupid, who had in fact chosen him specifically because she understood how he operated and had found it useful, and she was looking at him right now with an expression that told him she was doing the same arithmetic he'd done 4 days ago and arriving at the same answer. He had buried the report. She knew he had buried the report. The question was whether he was going to say it out loud. I made a judgment call, Grant said. I assessed the contractor's findings as preliminary and unverified, and I determined that raising it to the executive level without internal validation would create unnecessary alarm before the inspection. You determined. Her voice was perfectly level. Unilaterally. That a material safety report filed by an independent engineer regarding flight-critical components did not need to reach my desk. It was rerouted for internal review. There is no internal review. Dr. Leonard found it in a dead folder. She stood up. Get Andre Lawson on the phone. Grant's face flickered. We terminated his contract. I'm aware of what we did, Grant. Get him on the phone. It was Raul Bennett who finally made the call, because Arden's HR department had already closed Andre's contractor file and marked his contact information as archived, a bureaucratic detail that might have seemed trivial, except that it meant nobody in the executive suite could reach Andre directly without going through channels that moved at the speed of paperwork. Raul didn't go through channels. He called Andre's cell, the number saved in his personal phone, and Andre picked up on the first ring. She wants to talk to you. A pause. Claire Whitmore. Yes? Does she understand why? Dr. Leonard found your report in the archive this morning. He spent 30 minutes with it and told her it was real. She called Grant in. I don't know exactly what happened in that room, but 20 minutes later, her assistant was calling facilities trying to track down your contact information. Andre was quiet for a moment. Raul, where are we with Meridian? I was about to ask you the same thing. I called them this morning. Dr. Osai has completed the first thermal cycling phase. She's running the second phase now. She said she expects to have preliminary findings by this afternoon. Raul let out a long breath. If their results match your report, they'll match. Then we need those results before the federal inspection. Yes, Andre. Raul's voice dropped. Will you take Claire's call? Another pause. Longer this time. Andre wasn't deciding whether to take the call. That wasn't the kind of man he was. He was deciding how to take it. What to say and what not to say, and where the line was between helping a company fix its problem and participating in the management of a story that wasn't finished being told yet. "Give her my number," he said. "But Raul, I need you to understand something. If she calls me, I'm going to tell her the same thing I told her 4 days ago. The truth hasn't changed. The problem hasn't changed. The only thing that's changed is how much time we have left to fix it. I know. And I'm not going to help anyone manage this quietly. If those units are defective, the record needs to reflect that fully and honestly, regardless of what it costs the company. You understand what I'm saying?" "Yeah," Raul said. "Yeah, I do." "Okay, give her my number." He sat in his home office, the converted second bedroom, where he kept his equipment, his reference library, his filing system, and he waited. Maya was at school. The house was quiet. Outside it was a gray morning, the kind of morning that felt like it was withholding judgment. His phone rang 4 minutes later. "Mr. Lawson." Claire's voice was the same voice-controlled precise, carrying the authority of someone who ran a large organization and knew how to project composure. But there was something underneath it now that hadn't been there 4 days ago. A tautness, like a wire that had been pulled one increment past comfortable. "Ms. Whitmore, I've had the opportunity to review your full report this morning. I want to ask you some questions if you're willing." "I'm willing." "The thermal interaction model you used, is that based on the specific alloy specification for our flight control units, or is it a generalized model?" "It's specific. I pulled your coating specification from your product documentation and ran the interaction against the Halcyon solvent's published residue composition. Page 4 of the report, the table on the left." A brief pause. She was looking at it. "And the fracture propagation timeline, the 90-day window under high-stress conditions. That's a conservative estimate. It could be faster depending on the specific thermal cycling profile of the application. I'd need the actual flight operational data to narrow it." "The units are flight control components for a tactical aircraft system." Andre closed his eyes briefly. "Then you should assume the thermal cycling profile is aggressive. I'd revise the estimate to 60 days under sustained operational deployment, possibly less." Silence. "Mr. Lawson, I owe you an apology." He didn't say anything. "I dismissed your findings 4 days ago without reviewing them. I made a judgment based on factors that had nothing to do with the quality of your work, and that judgment was wrong." She paused. "I'm telling you that directly because I think you deserve to hear it directly." Andre looked at the wall of his home office, at the framed Air Force commendation above his desk, at the photograph of Maya at her last school play, grinning with a gap where she'd just lost a tooth. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it not warmly, but honestly. "What do you need from me right now?" "I need to know if there's any version of this where we can fix this before the federal inspection." The honest answer, the precise, accurate, technically correct answer, was probably not. Not completely. Not in 48 hours. The contamination was distributed across every unit processed with the Halcyon solvent over the past 6 weeks. A full remediation would require pulling every unit stripping and recoating the affected alloy surfaces and running a new thermal validation cycle on each one. That was not a 48-hour job, but that wasn't the only thing Claire was really asking. Underneath the operational question was a more human one. Is there anything left that can be saved? "Here's what I can tell you," Andre said. "You cannot ship those units in 48 hours. That's not a maybe, that is a certainty. The question is what you do with the 48 hours you have. Tell me. You contact Rebecca Shaw's office today, not tomorrow today, and you tell her that your internal quality review has identified a materials concern that requires additional validation before shipment. You request an inspection extension. You do this voluntarily, proactively, before she finds it herself." Silence. And then you fix it, the right way, completely, and you document every step. That kills the shipment timeline. The contract has penalty clauses for Ms. Whitmore. His voice was even. Rebecca Shaw's team runs extended thermal testing. There is a 14-hour test that will show them exactly what I showed you in that conference room 4 days ago. Except at that point, it will not be an Arden Materials report identifying the problem. It will be a federal contractor finding. And that is a fundamentally different situation, legally, contractually, and reputationally, than the one you are in right now. The silence on the other end was long. You're telling me to call them and admit the problem before they find it. I'm telling you that admitting it is the only version of this that gives you any control over the narrative. Every other version you lose the contract and the trust in that order. Another pause. When Claire spoke again, her voice had shifted, not softer exactly, but different. Stripped of something. The layer of corporate composure that a woman in her position put on every morning like a uniform. Is there any chance the Meridian lab results come back clean? No. Just that. No qualification, no softening. You're certain. Ms. Whitmore, I have been certain since 3 o'clock in the morning on the night your plant manager called me. I don't say things I'm not certain of. That's not who I am. Another silence. The longest one. All right, Claire said. All right. I'm going to need... She stopped. Started again. I'm going to need your help with this. I know I don't have any right to ask for it, but I'm asking anyway. Andre looked at the photograph of Maya. Call Rebecca Shaw, he said. Do it in the next 2 hours. I'll be available after that. He hung up. He sat in his quiet house with the gray morning outside the window, and he let the weight of the moment settle around him. Not with satisfaction, because there was nothing satisfying about being right about something like this. Not with anger, because the time for anger had passed. With something closer to a kind of solemn purpose, the feeling of a man who has held a difficult truth, steady against considerable pressure, and is now watching the truth do what truth eventually does. He opened his laptop. He started writing the technical outline for the remediation protocol, because he already knew what was coming next, and when it arrived, he intended to be ready. What Claire did not know, what Grant Mercer was, carefully not telling her, even as he sat 2 floors above in his office, realizing that the story he had constructed was beginning to come apart at the seams, was that the Meridian Laboratory had already emailed their preliminary findings to the contact address on Andre's requisition form. The email arrived at 2:17 p.m. Dr. Patricia Osei's preliminary report was 7 pages long, methodically structured, and written in the careful clinical language of a scientist who understood that her findings would be scrutinized by people with advanced degrees and possibly by attorneys. She had run 2 complete thermal cycling sequences on both sample units, pushing them through the exact temperature range specified in the flight control component's operational documentation. She had used a scanning electron microscope to examine the alloy coating at the conclusion of each cycle. Her findings confirmed Andre's model with a precision that was, in her words, remarkable, given that the predictive analysis was conducted in field conditions with standard portable equipment. The fractures were there. They were in both units. They were in the exact location Andre had predicted, at the exact depth, following the exact propagation pattern his thermal interaction model had projected. She had also, in the final section of her report, done something that went slightly beyond her standard scope of analysis. She had pulled the public technical literature on the halcyon solvent. The same documentation Andre had cited, and noted that the specific thermal interaction he had identified had been flagged in a German aerospace engineering journal 18 months earlier, in a paper that had received minimal circulation in the North American industry. The defect was not unknowable. It had been documented. It was simply that nobody at Arden Aeronautics had been looking in the right places. Or rather, someone had been looking. One person. Working through the night for $450. Andre read Meridian's report twice. Then he forwarded it to Raul Bennett's personal email with a single line, "Send this to Dr. Leonard. Tell him to put it on Claire's desk in the next 30 minutes. Then he went to make coffee, because the next 12 hours were going to be long, and he was going to need to be sharp for all of them. In Grant Mercer's office, the procurement files were neatly organized. The approval documentation was in order. Everything looked clean, but the email from Meridian was already moving through the building, and in a federal contracting office 30 miles away. Rebecca Shaw was looking at a revised inspection schedule and making her own preparations, completely unaware that the company she was about to visit had spent the last 4 days in a race between the truth and the clock. The truth, as it turned out, was faster. Rebecca Shaw arrived at Arden Aeronautics at 7:00 a.m. sharp, the way she always arrived early enough to catch the difference between a facility that was prepared and a facility that was performing preparation. She had been a federal contract director for 14 years, and in that time, she had developed a specific instinct for the gap between those two things. It lived somewhere in the way people moved when they saw her walk through the door. The half-second of recalibration, the too-quick smile, the energy of a room that had been briefed. Arden's lobby had all of it. Her team was 4 people, 2 materials engineers, a documentation specialist, and a federal quality auditor named Dennis Park, who had the particular gift of finding the one thing in a facility that nobody wanted him to find. They signed in, accepted their visitor badges, and followed Arden's head of operations down to the production floor. Rebecca walked slowly. She always did. She looked at things other people walked past. Claire Whitmore met them at the floor entrance, composed and precise, every inch the CEO she had always been. She shook Rebecca's hand with both of hers. "Rebecca, thank you for coming. We're fully prepared for the review." Rebecca looked at her for a moment. "Good. We'll start with the documentation package, and then I'd like my engineers on the floor." Of course. What Claire did not say what she had decided after 3 separate conversations with her legal counsel, and 1 very difficult conversation with her board chair the previous evening. Not to say until the inspection was underway, was that Arden had identified a materials concern, that the concern had been documented by an independent contractor 4 days earlier, that the independent laboratory had confirmed the findings 20 hours ago, that the remediation had not yet begun because the legal and executive team had spent those 20 hours debating the precise language with which to disclose a problem that Grant Mercer had done everything in his power to ensure nobody would ever have to disclose. She had not yet called Rebecca Shaw proactively. Andre had told her to call in 2 hours. She had not called. She had told herself it was because she needed more information, that she needed to see the Meridian report herself, review it fully, have Dr. Leonard validate it against Arden's internal data. She had told herself she was being thorough. But sitting across from Rebecca Shaw right now, watching the federal inspector's steady, unhurried eyes move across the production floor with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and every legal authority she needed, Claire understood with a cold clarity that what she had actually been doing for the last 20 hours was hoping. Hoping the Meridian report was wrong. Hoping Dr. Leonard would find a flaw in the analysis. Hoping that somehow in the space between the problem being real and the problem being found, there was a gap she could slip through. There was no gap. There never had been. Dennis Park requested extended thermal testing at 9:23 a.m. It was not in the standard inspection protocol. Standard was 12 hours document review, visual inspection, and a spot sample of component performance data. Dennis Park never ran standard. "I'd like to run your sampled units through extended thermal cycling, full operational range, sustained duration." The Arden operations manager, who was managing the inspection team, looked at his colleague. "Extended duration isn't typically part of the..." "No, it's not typically required. I'm requesting it as a supplemental assessment. We have the authority under Section 14 of the Contract Inspection Addendum." Dennis looked at him with the patient expression of a man who had quoted Section 14 of Contract Inspection Addenda before and was comfortable doing it again. "How long to set up the thermal chamber?" "About 40 minutes. "Great. I'll review documentation while we wait." The operations manager excused himself and walked quickly to a corner of the floor where he could use his phone without being immediately visible. He texted Claire's assistant. "They're running extended thermal. 14+ hours." The assistant walked the message to Claire's office in person. Claire read it. She set it on her desk. She looked out her window for a moment at the parking structure below. Then she picked up her phone and called Andre. He answered on the first ring. "They're running extended thermal." "I know," Andre said. "Raul texted me 10 minutes ago." "Andre, if they find it." "They'll find it." "Claire, I told you 2 days ago, call her proactively. You didn't call her." The silence on her end was the silence of a person receiving a truth they had been avoiding. It had its own specific weight. "I know. Okay, Here's where we are. When their test results come back, and they will come back showing exactly what I showed you. Rebecca Shaw is going to ask for your internal risk documentation. Every safety flag, every contractor report, every internal communication about the production line going back to when the halcyon solvent was approved. She has full contractual authority to request that. I understand. When she asks, you give her everything, all of it. My report, the emails, the rerouting, everything. You do not manage this. You do not curate it. You hand over the complete record. If I hand over the complete record, Grant made his own choices. You made yours. The record reflects both. That's how it has to be. Another silence. Andre. Her voice had dropped to something that was barely maintaining its professional register. What are the odds we keep the contract? He didn't answer immediately. He gave her the respect of not answering immediately, of letting the question sit for a full, honest beat, rather than reaching for something softer than the truth. The contract is gone, he said. That ship sailed 4 days ago when the right decision wasn't made. What you're managing now is everything else. Your other clients, your workforce, your company's ability to operate a year from now. Those things are still in play, but not the contract. She didn't respond. Are you still there? Yes. Very quiet. Yes, I'm still here. Call your board chair. Tell him what's coming before Rebecca Shaw does. Do it in the next hour. He heard her exhale. Okay. And Claire, whatever your attorneys tell you about managing disclosure, don't let them talk you into minimizing what happened. Full transparency is the only currency you have left with anyone who matters. Okay, she said again. And then, thank you for picking up the phone. She hung up. Andre sat in his home office in the gray morning quiet and thought about how strange it was, the thing that passed between people when the pretense was finally gone. 4 days ago she had looked at him like he was a delivery he hadn't ordered. Now she was calling him like he was the only solid ground in a room filling with water. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. And he had work to do. The thermal chamber ran for 14 hours and 22 minutes. At hour 12, Dennis Park was reviewing materials documentation at a workstation on the production floor when his lead engineer, a woman named Carla Voss, came and stood next to him with a tablet in her hands and a very specific expression on her face. She didn't say anything. She just turned the tablet toward him. He looked at the preliminary thermal imaging data from the chamber. He looked at the fracture mapping overlay. He looked at the location depth and propagation pattern of the stress fractures developing inside the alloy coating of the sampled units. He took the tablet. He looked at it for a full 30 seconds without speaking. Both units. Every sample we pulled. He handed the tablet back. Pull the full documentation package. Everything they've given us since we arrived. I want it on the table in 10 minutes. Dennis. Carla's voice dropped. This is a big one. Yeah. He stood up. Go get the documentation. He walked across the production floor to where Rebecca Shaw was finishing a conversation with Arden's quality director. She looked up when she saw his face and knew immediately the way. You know when you've worked alongside someone for 11 years and you understand the precise vocabulary of their expression, that whatever he was about to say was going to change the shape of the next several hours. Talk to me. We have fractures, both sampled units. 14 hours in presenting at the alloy coating interface consistent with a chemical residue interaction under sustained thermal cycling. He kept his voice low and level. This is not within acceptable parameters. This is a failure condition. Rebecca didn't react visibly. That was her gift, the ability to receive information that would make most people's faces do complicated things and absorb it without broadcasting it. How widespread? Unknown at this point. We need to know how many units were processed under the same conditions. All right. She straightened. I need to speak with Ms. Whitmore. Claire had been waiting. She was in the conference room, the same conference room where she had dropped Andre's invoice on the table 4 days ago when Rebecca walked in. No inspection team. Just Rebecca alone with a folder under her arm and the careful composure of a federal official about to deliver something official. She sat down across from Claire. Your sampled units failed extended thermal testing. We're seeing fractures in the alloy coating consistent with a residue interaction from your cleaning protocol. Claire met her eyes. I know. Rebecca went very still. You know. We identified the concern 4 days ago, through an independent contractor assessment. The silence in that room was a different kind of silence than the silences that had come before in this story. It was the silence of a moment that has crossed a line where what was possible before is no longer possible, and everyone present understands that simultaneously. You identified this 4 days ago. Yes. And the shipment was not held. No. Rebecca looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in her face, not yet anyway. There was something more controlled than anger. The focused attention of someone assembling a complete picture very quickly. I'm going to need your complete internal documentation. Everything related to the Halcyon solvent approval, the contractor assessment, and every internal communication about this production line from the last 8 weeks. You'll have it. Today, Ms. Whitmore. Today. Rebecca stood. I'm going to step out and make some calls. I'd ask that you not move any additional units out of the facility until we complete our assessment. Understood. Rebecca walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back once. Who was the contractor? His name is Andre Lawson. Do you have his contact information? Yes. I'll need that too. She left. Claire sat alone at the conference table for a moment. The same table, the same room. She looked at the chair where Andre had sat 4 days ago, opening his laptop, turning it toward her, sliding the photograph across the polished surface. She looked at the spot where she had dropped his invoice. She looked at the empty space where his access badge had been before she put it in the trash. Then she picked up her phone and called the board chair. The documentation request hit Grant Mercer's office at 2:15 p.m., delivered in writing by Arden's general counsel, with a covering note that said in the careful language of lawyers who understand when a situation has moved past the point of management, full compliance is required and expected. Please provide all responsive materials immediately. Grant read it twice. Then he called his personal attorney. He spoke for 4 minutes. He listened for 2. Then he hung up and sat very still at his desk, with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes on a point somewhere past the wall in front of him. The procurement files he had organized were still in order. The approval documentation was still clean. But the email trail, the original executive distribution of Andre's report, the rerouting instruction, the message he had sent Claire calling Andre's findings exaggerated and unverified, that trail existed in Arden's email servers. It had always existed. Emails don't disappear when you move a document to a dead folder. They exist in sent items. They exist in server logs. They exist in the archived records of every person who received or was copied on them. I had known this. Some part of him had known this from the beginning. But there is a specific human capacity for believing that a problem you don't look at directly will somehow resolve itself, that the gap between knowing and being known is wider than it actually is. Grant Mercer had spent 4 days in that gap. The gap had just closed. He picked up his phone. He called his assistant. Get me Claire. She's with the board chair. Tell her I need 5 minutes. A pause. Grant, she's asked not to be interrupted. He set the phone down. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the Arden email server. He found the rerouting instruction he had sent to his assistant on the morning of Andre's visit. He read it. He read the message he'd sent Claire calling Andre's work preliminary and unverified. He read the message he had sent his procurement director the morning after telling her to file the approval documentation under standard operational review. He closed the laptop. He sat in his office while the building moved around him, people in hallways, phones, ringing on other desks, the ordinary machinery of a company that did not yet fully understand what was happening to it. And he understood with the particular clarity of a man who has run out of moves that what happened next was not going to be something he controlled. Naomi Pierce found the email at 3:47 p.m. Naomi was a senior quality engineer, 12 years at Arden Methodical Quiet, the kind of person who kept records, the way some people keep faith because she believed that documentation was the only honest thing in a business environment where everything else was subject to interpretation. She had received Andre's original report via the executive distribution on the day it was filed. She had seen it arrive. She had flagged it internally to her supervisor, who had told her it was being reviewed by the COO's office. She had let it go, because that was what you did when your supervisor told you something was being handled. You let it go, and you trusted the system. For 4 days, she had been carrying a low-grade unease that she couldn't fully name. The kind of professional discomfort that lives just below the level of action. The feeling that something important is not being handled the way it should be, without sufficient evidence to push back. The Meridian report changed that. Dr. Leonard had forwarded it to the quality division that morning, per Andre's instruction relayed through Raul. Naomi had read it in her office with the door closed, going slowly through each section, comparing it against the internal production data she had access to from the last 6 weeks. She cross-referenced the dates of the Halcyon solvent adoption with the production logs. Halcyon solvent adoption with the production logs. She pulled up the quality sampling data from the units processed under the new protocol, and then she went looking for Andre's original report in the system. She found it in the secondary archive folder, not in her own files, but in the executive distribution archive that she had access to as a senior quality engineer. She found the routing metadata. She found the timestamp of when it had been moved out of the active review queue. She found the user ID that had initiated the rerouting. She sat with that information for 90 seconds. Then she printed the routing log, put it in a folder, and walked down 2 floors to where Rebecca Shaw's documentation team had set up a review station in one of the conference rooms. She knocked on the open door. The documentation specialist looked up. "My name is Naomi Pierce. I'm a senior quality engineer. I have some internal routing records I think you need to see." Rebecca Shaw called Andre at 4:30 p.m. He was at his desk working on the remediation protocol outline he'd started 2 days earlier when the call came from an unknown number. "Mr. Lawson, this is Rebecca Shaw, Federal Contract Director. I understand you conducted an independent materials assessment of Arden Aeronautics Flight Control Line 7. That's correct. Your preliminary report was filed 4 days ago. Yes, ma'am. And your samples were submitted to Meridian Technical Services for independent verification. Correct. Dr. Osei has the case file." A brief pause. "Mr. Lawson, our extended thermal testing today confirmed the defect you identified. The fracture location depth and propagation pattern are consistent with your model." Andre didn't say anything. "I've also reviewed the internal documentation from Arden, including the routing log for your original report." Another pause. "You filed a complete, accurate safety assessment 4 days ago. You distributed it to multiple internal recipients. You submitted independent lab samples. You documented everything." "Yes." "And the shipment was not held?" "No." He heard her exhale, very controlled, barely audible. The exhale of a federal official whose patience is measured in years and who is nonetheless running it close to its limit. "I'd like to ask you something directly, Mr. Lawson, and I'd appreciate a direct answer." "Go ahead." "In your professional assessment based on what you found, what the Meridian Lab confirmed, and what you know about the scope of the Halcyon solvent adoption at this facility, how many units are we talking about?" "Every unit processed with the Halcyon solvent from the date of adoption. Based on the production logs Raul Bennett shared with me, that's 6 weeks of production. I'd estimate you're looking at somewhere between 800 and 1,200 units, depending on the line efficiency during that period." A silence that had real weight. Every unit processed under the new protocol. None of the units from the prior 6 months are affected. The original solvent doesn't produce the residue interaction. And full remediation. Strip and recoat the alloy surface on every affected unit. Validate with thermal cycling retest before shipment. It's not fast. At full production capacity with proper process controls, you're looking at 8 to 10 weeks. The contract delivery window is 21 days. I know. Another silence. "Mr. Lawson, I want you to understand something. What you did filing that report, submitting those samples, maintaining your documentation, that matters. What happens to this contract, whatever the outcome for Arden, what you did mattered. He looked at the photograph of Maya on his desk. "Thank you, Ms. Shaw. I'll be in touch." She hung up. Andre sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about Master Sergeant Wallace back at Ramstein, saying, "Your job is to make sure the record is clean." He thought about what it cost to keep the record clean when everyone around you was invested in the record being unclear. He thought about the $450 check he had not yet been paid. Arden's accounts payable had processed his cancellation without issuing payment. A bureaucratic oversight that he had noted and chosen not to address yet, because there were more important things. There would be time for the $450 later. There would be time for a lot of things later. The board meeting convened at 6:00 p.m. Claire stood at the head of the table and delivered the full picture without softening any of it. The Halcyon solvent adoption. The cost savings. The contractor assessment on day 1. The report. The rerouting. The independent laboratory. The federal inspection. The failed thermal test. The documentation that Naomi Pierce had walked to Rebecca Shaw's team that afternoon. All of it. When she finished this board chair, a 70-year-old man named Harold Fitch, who had built 3 companies and sold 2 of them, and was not a person who frightened easily, looked at her across the table with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Grant Mercer suppressed the report. "Yes, with your implicit authorization to proceed." She didn't look away. "I canceled the contractor's job without reading his report. I gave Grant the environment in which that decision was possible. That's on me." Harold looked around the table. Nobody spoke. "Where is Grant now?" "In his office." Harold looked at Arden's general counsel. "Get him in here." Grant walked into the board meeting 8 minutes later. He sat at the end of the table. He looked at Claire. He looked at Harold. He looked at the faces of 11 board members who had all read the same routing log by now. Harold spoke first. "Did you reroute the contractor's safety report to prevent it reaching executive review?" Grant's attorney, who had been called in and was sitting against the wall, started to say something. "Don't." Harold didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I'm asking him." Grant looked at his hands. He looked at the table. He looked at the place where every path he might have taken over the last 4 days converged into this single, inescapable point. "Yes." One word. The room absorbed it. "You're dismissed," Harold said. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Grant stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a reflex, a habit, the automatic gesture of a man who had spent 20 years ensuring that his appearance communicated control. He looked at Claire. She looked back at him. He walked to the door. The security manager who had been waiting in the hallway fell in beside him, and Grant Mercer, who had been chief operating officer of Arden Aeronautics for 11 years, walked out of the building he had helped build, through the lobby, past the receptionist, who did not look up, and out into the parking structure, where the evening air was cool, and the ordinary world was continuing without reference to anything that had happened inside. Rebecca Shaw issued her formal determination at 7:45 p.m. The $650 million federal contract was suspended pending full remediation of all affected units and a comprehensive third-party safety audit of Arden's quality assurance protocols. Given the timeline required for complete remediation and the federal procurement calendar, the contract would be re-awarded to a qualified alternate manufacturer. Arden Aeronautics had not lost the contract because of the defect. The language of Rebecca's determination was precise on this point. The finding was not that Arden had produced a defective component. Defects happened in manufacturing, and the federal contracting system had protocols for managing them. The finding was that Arden had received a documented safety warning from a qualified independent contractor, had suppressed that warning through deliberate executive action, and had continued production and prepared to ship safety-critical components while aware of an unresolved materials concern. That was not a defect. That was a breakdown of integrity. And that Rebecca's determination was clear was why the contract was gone. Standing in the empty conference room after the board meeting had adjourned, Claire Whitmore read the determination on her phone. She read the specific language. She read the part that said, "Documented safety warning from a qualified independent contractor." She read it twice. Then she called her assistant and asked her to find Andre Lawson's number, Not from Raul, not from the contractor file, but directly because she wanted to call him herself. Her assistant read her the number. Claire looked at it on her screen for a long moment. Then she called. Andre picked up on the second ring. He was in his kitchen. She could hear in the background the faint sound of a television. Something animated, something that sounded like a cartoon, and then a child's voice asking something, and Andre saying quietly, "Give me a minute, baby." And then his voice steady and even. "Ms. Whitmore." "The contract's been terminated," she said. Rebecca Shaw's determination just came through. "I know. She sent me a copy." "She sent you a copy. She wanted me to know the record had been acknowledged." Claire stood in the empty conference room. Through the window the city had gone dark, and the lights of 1,000 other buildings were doing what they always did, burning steady, indifferent, and permanent. "I stood in that room 4 days ago," she said, "and I looked you in the eye and told you we weren't stopping a $650 million shipment for a $450 theory. Yes, I want you to know that I understand now what I actually said, what I was really saying underneath the words." He waited. "I was saying that the number next to your invoice told me how much your opinion was worth, and the number was small, so I decided the opinion was small." She stopped. "That had nothing to do with the quality of your work. It had nothing to do with your experience or your credentials or what you actually found. It was—" She stopped again. "It was something else. And I want to say that directly because you deserve to have it said directly." The silence on his end was not hostile. It was the silence of a man receiving something that he had known was true and had not needed to be told, but was hearing said aloud by the person who needed to say it. "I appreciate that," he said. "I don't expect that to fix anything." "No, it doesn't fix anything." A pause. "But it's the right thing to say, so thank you for saying it." The cartoon sounds in the background had gone quiet. Maya had gone to another room, or maybe to bed. The house behind Andre Lawson's voice was still. "I need your help," Claire said. "Not to save the contract. I know that's gone. But I have 800 employees who didn't make any of these decisions, and I have clients who haven't walked away yet, and I have a company that is either going to survive the next 90 days or it isn't. And I don't know how to fix the technical side of this without you." Andre was quiet for a moment. "I'll tell you what I told you before. I'll give you the truth, and I'll give you my best work, and I won't manage anything to make it easier to hear. If that's what you need, I can help." "That's what I need." "Then we start tomorrow morning," he said. 7 o'clock. Put me in a room with Raul Bennett, Naomi Pierce, and your production floor team. Not your executives, your engineers. Done. And Claire, one more thing." "What?" "The $450. Have accounting cut that check tonight." She almost laughed. It was the sound a person makes when they are too tired for actual laughter, but close enough to it to feel the distance. "Tonight," she said. "Good night, Ms. Whitmore." "Good night, Mr. Lawson." He hung up. He stood in his kitchen for a moment, in the quiet of a house, where a 9-year-old girl was asleep in her room, and the weight of the last 4 days settled around him fully for the first time. Not with triumph. Not with bitterness. With something that was harder to name, the feeling of a man who has done the thing he was built to do under conditions designed to make him quit, and is still standing on the other side of it, with his integrity exactly where he left it. He turned off the kitchen light. He checked on Maya, asleep, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed the way she always slept, her water cycle project on the desk by the window, finished and ready for Friday. He went to his desk. He opened a new document. He began writing the remediation protocol. He worked until midnight, outside the city, did what cities do. It moved and breathed and continued without awareness of the specific human accounting that had taken place inside one building that day. 800 workers whose jobs had just become uncertain. A federal contract that would not return. A COO who had walked out of a building with nothing but the suit he was wearing and choices he could not take back. A CEO who was going to spend the next 3 months learning what her company actually was down on the floor where the work happened. And Andre Lawson at his desk at midnight, writing the document that would tell Arden Aeronautics how to fix what it had broken. Not because they deserved it, because 800 people who had nothing to do with the decision deserved a chance. That was the difference. That had always been the difference. Andre arrived at Arden Aeronautics at 6:52 a.m. No appointment, no escort, no executive title on a lanyard. The same worn laptop bag, the same work boots with the scuff marks along the toe. He signed in at the security desk, and the guard, a heavy-set man named Curtis, who had worked the morning shift for 9 years, looked at his name on the visitor list and then looked at his face. "You're the contractor, the one from last week." "Yes." Curtis printed his badge. He slid it across the desk. Then he did something he didn't typically do with visitors. He looked Andre in the eye and said quietly, so the lobby didn't hear it, "We heard what you found. A lot of folks on the floor. They're glad somebody said something." Andre took the badge. "How many people work in this building?" 812 full-time, another 60 contract. Andre clipped the badge to his shirt. "Then let's make sure they still have jobs in 90 days. He took the elevator down, not up, not to the 38th floor, down to the production level, where Raul Bennett was already waiting with Naomi Pierce and a group of 8 floor engineers who had been pulled off their regular assignments and told only that there was a meeting at 7 o'clock. They were standing in the loose cluster near the main production entrance, most of them with coffee cups, a few of them with the careful expressions of people who understood that something significant was happening and weren't sure yet whether it was going to be good or bad for them personally. Raul stepped forward when Andre came through the door and shook his hand the way you shake the hand of someone you owe something to. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. How's the floor?" "Scared," Raul said honestly. "Word got around last night about the contract. People are worried." "Okay." Andre looked at the group. "Let's get started." He didn't do introductions. He didn't do a presentation. He set his laptop bag on a work table, opened it, pulled out the remediation protocol he'd written until midnight, and spread it across the surface in printed sections. "My name is Andre Lawson. I'm the materials engineer who identified the defect in your Line 7 cleaning protocol. I've been brought in to lead the safety recovery for the next 90 days. Before we talk about how we fix this, I want to hear from you. What do you know about this problem? Not what management told you, what you know from being on this floor." A silence. Then a woman near the back, small, precise, with the look of someone who had been doing this work for a long time and was not easily impressed by titles, raised her hand. "I'm Diane, Line 7-day supervisor. I noticed the residue change when we switched solvents 6 weeks ago. Left a different kind of film on the components after evaporation. I flagged it to my shift lead." "What happened?" "He said the new solvent was approved and to keep running." Andre nodded. He looked at the rest of the group. "Who else noticed something?" 3 more hands went up. Claire came down to the production floor at 8:15 a.m. Not because she had a scheduled appearance. Not because her communications team had arranged a photo opportunity or a morale message. She came because Andre had said, "Put me in a room with your engineers, not your executives." And she had been thinking about that sentence since midnight, and at some point around 3:00 a.m., she had understood that he hadn't just been giving her a practical instruction. He had been giving her a diagnosis. She found them at the work table. Andre in the center. Raul on his left. Naomi on his right. 8 engineers arranged around the table with printed pages and coffee cups, and the focused energy of people who had been given, for possibly the first time in a long time, the direct responsibility of solving a real problem. She stood at the edge of the group for a moment before anyone noticed her. Andre noticed her first. He looked up. He didn't stop what he was saying. He finished the sentence, something about the thermal validation sequence, and then he looked at the engineers. "Ms. Whitmore, come in." She walked to the table. Several of the engineers straightened slightly, the reflex of people recalibrating their posture around a CEO. Andre watched that happen and said without making a performance of it, "We're working. Everyone stays focused." The engineers looked at him, looked at Claire, and slowly, visibly chose to stay focused. Claire pulled up a stool at the corner of the table. She did not take the head position. She sat where there was space, and she listened. What she heard over the next 40 minutes was the story of her own company as told by the people who actually ran it. Diane and her flagged residue report that went nowhere. A line technician named Marcus who had written 3 informal notes about vibration anomalies over 4 weeks and filed them in a shared digital folder that nobody in management reviewed. A quality checker named Yolanda, who had developed her own informal double-check protocol because she didn't trust that the automated system was catching everything and had been told by her supervisor that the informal protocol was unnecessary and should be discontinued. Claire listened to all of it. She didn't interrupt, she didn't explain, she didn't defend. At one point, Marcus, the line technician, 26 years old, 3 years with the company, looked at her directly and said, "I wrote those notes because I thought somebody was going to read them. I didn't know they were just going into a folder." Claire held his gaze. "I know. I'm sorry." He looked at her for a moment, deciding something. Then he looked back at Andre. "What do you need from me today?" "Time." The remediation protocol Andre had written was from a purely technical standpoint, a masterpiece of systematic thinking. Raul said that to him privately, standing at the coffee machine during a brief break mid-morning. "You wrote this overnight." "Most of it. I had the framework in my head from the night I was on the floor. The sequencing, the way you've broken down the unit batches by production date and cross-referenced them with the solvent adoption timeline that's going to save us probably 2 weeks on the isolation phase. That's the goal." Raul looked at his coffee. "Andre, I need to ask you something and I need you to answer me honestly." "Go ahead." "When Claire called you last night when she asked for your help, what made you say yes after everything that happened? After the way she treated you in that room? After Grant buried your report? After—" He stopped. "Why did you say yes?" Andre was quiet for the moment. He looked at the production floor through the break room window, the engineers back at the table, Naomi working through the batch documentation with 2 of the line supervisors, Diane explaining something to Yolanda with a pen and a printed diagram. "You called me on a Tuesday night," Andre said. "You told me you had a problem on a flight control production line. You told me it might be nothing. You asked me if I could come take a look." "Yeah. I didn't come for $450. You know that." "I know that. I came because you said flight control units. And because I spent 6 years in the Air Force and I know what those words mean, and I know what happens when somebody ignores what those words mean." He turned back to Raul. 800 people in this building didn't make the decisions that got us here. They showed up, they did their jobs, they filed their reports into folders. Nobody read, they kept running lines because they were told everything was fine. Those people— He paused. "I said yes because of them." Raul looked at him for a long moment. "You're a better man than most." "I'm just a man who knows what he's for," Andre said. "Come on, we've got work to do." Naomi Pierce proved herself indispensable within the first 4 hours. She had 12 years of Arden's production records in her head, like a second language, which lines had run, which protocols, which supervisors kept thorough logs, where the gaps were in the documentation system, and how to work around them. She sat beside Andre for most of that first day and translated between what the remediation protocol required and what the actual facility could execute, filling in the spaces where theory met the practical reality of 800 people trying to keep a company alive. At one point, mid-afternoon, she and Andre were cross-referencing batch numbers when she stopped and looked at him. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "The night you were here when you found it, when you had the full picture." She paused. "What did it feel like, knowing what you knew, and knowing that you might walk out of here and nobody would listen?" Andre thought about that for a moment. "It felt like every other time in my career I've found something real and had to decide what to do with it." "That's not an answer." He almost smiled. "It felt bad," he said. "It felt like standing in a burning building and being told the smoke detector is broken, but everything is probably fine. It felt like the specific kind of bad that comes from being right about something you desperately wish you were wrong about." He looked at the batch numbers. "But I've been trained by the Air Force by 30 years of this work that the feeling doesn't change what you do. You document it. You distribute it. You make the record clean. And then you let the truth do what truth does." Naomi was quiet. "The thing about truth," Andre continued, "is that it doesn't care about your timeline. It doesn't care about your contract deadline, or your quarterly report, or your annual bonus. It just sits there patient until the conditions are right for it to show itself. Your job. My job is to make sure that when it shows up, the record shows that somebody said something. Somebody tried. Naomi looked at the papers in front of her. I found your email in the archive folder, the routing log. I know, Rebecca Shaw told me. When I walked that documentation to her team, she stopped. I want you to know that was the hardest thing I've done at this company. 11 years of trying to do good work, of trusting that the system mostly worked. And then walking into a federal inspector's office and saying, here is the proof that my company buried a safety report. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that takes effort. I need you to know that wasn't easy. I know it wasn't, but I couldn't not do it. No, Andre said. You couldn't, because you're someone who knows what she's for too. He looked at her. That's why I asked for you in this room today. By the end of the first day, the isolation phase was fully mapped. Andre had divided the affected unit inventory into 4 categories: confirmed contaminated, probable contaminated, possible contaminated, and unaffected, based on production, date, solvent, batch records, and the specific Line 7 processing logs. The confirmed and probable categories accounted for approximately 940 units. The possible category was another 200. The unaffected units, those produced before the Halcyon solvent adoption, were cleared for existing client fulfillment that was unrelated to the federal contract. He presented the breakdown to Claire and the remaining senior leadership at 5:30 p.m. The acting COO, a quiet, competent woman named Patricia Huang, who had been Arden's head of operations for 7 years and had been handed Grant's responsibilities that morning with about 12 hours' notice, sat at the table with a notepad and wrote everything down. Claire listened. She asked questions. Specific technical questions, not the questions of someone trying to manage a narrative, but the questions of someone actually trying to understand what had happened and what needed to happen next. At the end of the presentation, she looked at the timeline. 10 weeks for full remediation. At your current production capacity, yes. If you bring in additional recoding equipment and run extended shifts with voluntary overtime, you might compress it to 8. And during those 8 to 10 weeks, your other clients are receiving units from unaffected production batches. As long as you maintain full transparency with them about the issue, the remediation timeline, and the testing protocol you're implementing, the large majority of them will stay. They're not going to walk because you had a problem. They might walk if they find out you had a problem and managed it dishonestly. Patricia wrote something on her notepad. What do we tell them specifically? The truth, specifically. Andre looked around the table. I know that sounds simple. I know it doesn't feel simple. But I want you to hear me clearly on this. The moment you start curating what you tell your clients, you are back in the same position you were in 4 days ago. And the outcome the second time will be worse. Silence around the table. I'll draft the client disclosure language tonight if you want, Naomi said from the corner. If that helps. Claire looked at her. Yes, please. 3 days into the remediation. Something happened that Andre had not anticipated. The floor workers started coming to him, not in formal meetings. Not through the scheduled team sessions he was running twice daily. They came in the breaks in the hallways, in the moments when the structured part of the day gave way to the informal. A line technician would find him at the coffee machine and say quietly, I want to tell you about something I saw 6 months ago. A quality checker would pull him aside after a team session and say, there was another report that got rerouted, not yours one from before, about a different line. A floor supervisor would slip a handwritten note under the break room door with a name and a department, and the words, ask this person about the documentation protocol change in March. They were talking to him because he was the first person in a long time who had asked them what they knew, and then listened. Andre documented everything. He added it to the remediation record. He brought it to Naomi, who knew the system well enough to contextualize it, and together they began assembling a picture of Arden Aeronautics that went deeper than the immediate crisis. A picture of a company where the systems for raising concerns had been slowly, informally, and probably unintentionally eroded over years of prioritizing speed and cost efficiency above everything else. On the fourth evening, he was still at the facility at 9 o'clock, finishing a batch verification review with Raul, when Claire appeared at the door of the engineering workroom. She looked tired. Not the composed, managed tiredness of an executive, genuinely tired, the kind that shows in the set of the jaw and the eyes. "Can I talk to you?" Raul looked at Andre. Andre looked at Claire. "Give me 5 minutes to finish this section." She waited in the hallway. When he came out, she was standing with her back against the wall, and her arms crossed, not aggressively the way people cross their arms to defend, but the way people cross their arms when they are cold or exhausted and looking for something solid. "How are we doing?" she asked. Honestly better than I expected after day one. Your floor team is strong. Raul knows this facility inside out. Naomi is probably the best quality engineer I've worked with in 15 years. He paused. You have good people, Claire. They've been working around a system that wasn't built to hear them. She absorbed that. The board asked me today to submit my formal resignation. He looked at her. I told them I'd submit it on one condition, that I'm allowed to stay for 90 days to complete the remediation commitments. Harold agreed. That's the right call. Is it? She looked at the floor for a moment. Sometimes I think the right call would have been to resign immediately and let someone else come in who isn't carrying the weight of what I got wrong here. Someone who walks in clean. Someone who walks in clean also walks in not knowing what Diane knows, or Marcus, or Naomi. The remediation is working right now, partly because your people trust that the person at the top is invested in getting it right. A new face wouldn't have that. Not in week one. She considered that. You could have that. You have it already, in fact. I'm not your CEO. No, I know. She looked at him directly. Andre, I want to ask you something. And I want you to give me a real answer, not a professional answer. Okay. When you walked out of that conference room last week after I canceled your contract, after I said what I said, what did you actually think in that moment? Not the professional response. What did you actually think? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the question had time to settle fully before he answered it. I thought she just looked at me and saw a $450 invoice. She didn't see 31 years. She didn't see 6 years in the Air Force. She didn't see the families I've kept safe by finding the things automated systems miss. She saw a number, and she decided that number was the size of what I was worth. He paused. And then I thought that's her problem to carry, not mine. My job was to document what I found and make sure the record was clean. So I did that, and I walked out, and I went home and made dinner for my daughter. Claire was very still. You have a daughter? Maya. She's 9. You went home and made dinner for your daughter? Yes. She looked at the wall across from her. When she spoke again, her voice was different, stripped of everything professional, everything executive, everything that was performance rather than person. I have a son, she said. He's 32. He's an engineer, structural, not materials. Every time I talk to him about his work, he tells me about problems. He found things, he flagged anomalies he noticed. And I always tell him, document everything. Make sure your supervisor knows. Make sure there's a record. She stopped. I tell him that because I believe it. I believe that the person who finds the real problem is the most valuable person in the room. Her voice dropped. And then a man walked into my conference room and found the real problem, and I told him it wasn't worth my time. Andre didn't say anything. I know that an apology doesn't fix the contract. I know it doesn't fix what Grant did, or what the company did, or what any of this cost the people on that floor. I know that. She looked at him. But I need you to know that I understand what I was really doing when I looked at you in that room. And I'm ashamed of it. The hallway was very quiet. Thank you for saying that, Andre said. I mean that. Does it matter? Does it actually matter that I said it? I thought about it. Really thought about it the way he thought about engineering problems, carefully, honestly, without letting sentiment blur the precision. Yes, he said finally. Not because it changes anything that happened. but because the next person who walks into a room, you're running the next contractor, the next floor worker, the next engineer who finds something real and needs someone with authority to take it seriously. They're going to be treated differently because you said it. That matters. She looked at him for a long moment. I want to offer you a permanent position. Executive VP of Engineering Safety. Full authority. You would report directly to me or to my successor, depending on what the board decides. No title above you in your technical chain of command. He had been waiting for this. No. She didn't look surprised. Why? Because what you need is not one person with authority over safety. What you need is a system where every person in this building has a protected functional pathway to raise a concern and know it will reach the right ears. One executive VP doesn't build that. The right protocols build that. The right culture builds that. So help me build it. I'll help you build it from the outside, as an independent contractor. No equity, no title, no corner office. I do my best work when I'm not inside the structure I'm evaluating. She looked at him. And you trust that arrangement after what happened with the last contract. For the first time that evening, something that was almost a smile moved across Andre's face. Let's make sure the new contract is very clearly worded. On the 9th day of the remediation, Harold Fitch came down to the production floor. He did not announce it. He did not bring communications staff. He was 70 years old and had built companies, and he understood at 70 what he had not understood at 50, that the real condition of an organization is never visible from the top. It is visible only from the floor. He walked slowly, the way old men who respect the work walk through a place where work is being done, and he stopped near the workstation where Andre was running a batch verification review with 3 line technicians. He watched for several minutes without speaking. Then he stepped forward and put his hand out. Harold Fitch. Andre shook it. Andre Lawson. I know who you are. Harold looked at the workstation, at the verification sheets, at the thermal testing data running on the monitor. Is it going to hold? The remediation, yes, if the protocol is maintained. And after the 90 days when you're not here, Andre looked at him steadily. That depends on whether the people running this company decide that what happened last week is a lesson or just a crisis that got managed. Harold looked at him for a long moment. He had the eyes of a man who had interviewed a lot of people over a lot of years and developed a very accurate reading of the distance between what people said and what they meant. What would make it a lesson? Structural change, a formal safety review pathway with guaranteed executive access, protection for workers who raise concerns, mandatory response timelines for contractor assessments on safety-critical production lines, and someone like Pierce in a senior role with real authority. Not just the title, but the actual authority to halt production when the numbers say, halt production. Harold nodded slowly. Is that in your remediation report? It will be. Final section. I'm writing it now. Good. Harold looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Andre. I'm going to tell you something that I don't typically say to contractors. What you did, the way you handled yourself, what you documented, how you behaved after they shut you out. That is the kind of professional conduct I have been trying to hire for 50 years and never found enough of. He paused. Whatever you charge for the next engagement, charge more. Andre looked at him. I'll keep that in mind. Harold nodded once. He looked at the production floor, at the workers moving through the remediation protocol, with the careful, deliberate energy of people who understood that what they were doing mattered, and then he walked back toward the elevator. On the last evening of the 4th week after the isolation phase was complete, and the recoding process was running on schedule, and the independent verification protocol was producing clean results on every tested unit, Andre sat in the engineering workroom alone for a few minutes before packing up. Raul knocked on the door. Got a minute? Sure. Raul came in and sat across the table. He had the look of a man who had made it through something difficult and was taking a moment to acknowledge that fact before moving on. Naomi's been offered the VP role, he said. She accepted. Good, she earned it. And the board approved the safety review protocol. The full version, all the structural changes you put in the final section of the remediation report. Mandatory response timelines, protected reporting pathway, the whole thing. I know, Claire called me this afternoon. Raul leaned back. How does it feel 90 days ago you walked into this building for $450 and you walked out with your contract canceled? Now the company is rebuilding its entire safety infrastructure around what you found. Andre thought about that. You know what it feels like. It feels like the work worked. That's it. The work did what work is supposed to do when it's done right and the record is clean. He started packing his laptop bag. It's not about me. It was never about me. The floor workers who kept showing up and doing their jobs, they're the ones who made this remediation work. Naomi who walked those documents to Rebecca Shaw when it would have been easier not to. You who called me on a Tuesday night because you had a problem and you trusted yourself enough to know it was real. He zipped the bag. That's what did this, not me. Raul was quiet for a moment. You know the federal contract, it's not coming back. I know. Does that bother you? That after all this, the one thing that could have been saved, that big number? Raul. Andre looked at him. The contract was gone the moment the report got buried. Everything that happened after that was just the truth catching up to the decision. What we saved in the last 4 weeks isn't the contract. It's the company. And the 800 people in it. He stood up. That's worth more than $650 million. It just doesn't show up on a balance sheet. He picked up his bag. He looked around the engineering workroom, the whiteboards covered in diagrams, the batch verification folders stacked on the work table, the thermal testing data still running on the monitor. Go home, Raul. Be with your family. Yeah, Raul stood. Andre, thank you for all of it. Andre put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder, the same way he had on the first night in the break room, when this had all just been a phone call and a gut feeling, and a Tuesday night that neither of them had known would change everything. You called because you knew something was wrong, Andre said. That was the brave part. The rest was just engineering. He walked out of the engineering workroom through the production floor past the workers on the evening shift, running the recoding protocol with clean, methodical precision, past the quality check stations where the thermal validation results were coming back. Green, genuinely green. Not the automated green that covered a lie, but the real green of a defect found and fixed and documented from beginning to end. He stopped for a moment at the main production entrance. He looked back at the floor. Then he walked out. His truck was in the same parking structure in a different spot than the one he'd used 4 weeks ago. He put his bag in the passenger seat. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. He called Maya. She picked up on the first ring. Dad, are you done? Done for now, baby. Are you coming home? I'm coming home. I made dinner. Well, I started dinner. It's kind of just rice, and I think I forgot to add the seasoning. He started the truck. I'll fix it when I get there. Okay. Dad? Yeah. Were you the one who fixed the thing? The thing at the company. Kiana's mom works there, and she told Kiana that someone came in and fixed everything and kept everybody's jobs. He pulled out of the parking structure into the evening air. I helped, he said. A lot of people helped. But you were the one who started it. I thought about Raul calling him on a Tuesday night. He thought about Naomi walking the routing log to Rebecca Shaw's table. He thought about Diane flagging a residue change that nobody listened to. He thought about Marcus filing 3 notes into a folder he didn't know was empty. A lot of people started it, he said. I just happened to be the one who showed up when it mattered most. Maya was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking about something carefully. That's still important, she said. Yeah, Andre said. I know, baby, I know. He drove home through the city, through the ordinary evening of a world that had continued running, while one company learned the hardest version of a lesson it should have learned without needing to lose $650 million to understand it. The lesson was simple. The lesson had always been simple. The work tells you the truth if you're willing to listen. And the person standing in front of you, with the truth in their hands, is not made larger or smaller by the number at the bottom of their invoice. Andre Lawson had known that his whole life. The only question was whether the people who needed to learn it now would remember it long enough to change. The $450 check arrived on a Monday morning. Andre was at his desk when the envelope came. Standard mail. Arden Aeronautics return address in the upper left corner. His name typed cleanly in the center. He opened it. The check was for exactly $450 made out to Andre Lawson, with a memo line that said, Contractor Services Facility, 7 inspection. No bonus. No additional compensation. Just the original amount the number Claire had used to measure him 4 weeks ago. He looked at it for a moment. Then he set it on his desk and went back to what he was working on. Maya came into the home office an hour later, school backpack already on, looking for her lunch bag, and she saw the check on the desk. Is that the money from the job? Yes. She looked at it. $450. That's all they paid you. That's what the job was worth. She frowned the specific frown she had that meant she was running numbers in her head, and the numbers weren't making sense. But you saved the whole company. Kiana's mom still has her job because of you. Lots of people still have their jobs because of lots of people who did the right thing. But you, Maya. He looked at her. The $450 isn't the point. It never was. If I'd done the job for the money, I would have walked out of that conference room when the CEO told me to, and never thought about it again. I did the job because it needed doing. Those are different things. She considered that with the particular gravity of a 9-year-old who is deciding whether an adult explanation is satisfying or a polite way of avoiding the real answer. So are you going to cash it? He picked up the check. He held it for a moment. Yeah, he said. I'm going to cash it, because I earned it. She nodded slowly, like that made sense in a way she hadn't expected. Then she found her lunch bag, kissed his cheek, and headed out the door. Andre listened to the front door close. He looked at the check. He thought about standing in that conference room with 4 executives watching, and Claire Whitmore's voice saying, "We are not delaying a $650 million shipment for a $450 theory." He thought about how much had changed since that sentence, and how much hadn't. The $650 million was still gone. The check in his hand was still $450. The number hadn't moved. But what the number meant had changed entirely. He put the check in his wallet. He went back to work. Claire Whitmore's last day as CEO of Arden Aeronautics was a Thursday, 91 days after the federal contract was terminated. She had asked at the start of her final month to spend her last 2 weeks not in the executive suite, but on the production floor, working alongside the people she had governed from 38 floors above for 11 years. Harold Fitch had looked at her when she made the request and said simply, "All right." Her communications team had wanted to frame it as a leadership initiative, a final statement about her commitment to the company's values. She had told them no. "I'm not doing it for a statement," she had said. "I'm doing it because I spent 11 years not understanding how this company actually worked. I have 2 weeks left. I'd like to spend them understanding it." So for 2 weeks, Claire Whitmore arrived at Arden at 6:45 a.m. earlier than she had arrived for most of the 11 years she'd been CEO in sensible shoes and a work badge that said her name without a title underneath it. She stood at production stations. She learned the recoding process from Diane, who turned out to be one of the best teachers she had ever encountered. She sat in the break room during shift changes and listened to workers talk about their families, their commutes, the things that mattered to them outside these walls. On the 3rd day, a line worker named Gerald, 20 years with Arden, broad-shouldered, quiet, sat down across from her at the break room table with his coffee and looked at her directly. "Can I ask you something? Please." Before all this happened, the contractor, the inspection, all of it, did you know? About the way things were working down here, that reports were getting lost, that concerns weren't getting through. Claire held his gaze. "No, I didn't know. And I should have." Gerald turned his coffee cup in his hands. "My supervisor told me last year that the new reporting protocol was going to make things more efficient. What it actually did was add 3 extra steps before a concern reached anyone with authority to act on it. I raised it once. I was told the protocol was approved by executive operations, which meant it came from Grant Mercer's office. I didn't know that. I just knew it came from above, and I didn't push back. Would you have pushed back if you'd known there was a way to do it safely? He looked at her. Depends on whether the person at the top was actually listening. She nodded. I understand. He looked at his coffee. My wife works here too, line 4. We were both pretty scared when the contract news came out. We've got 3 kids. He paused. I want you to know that what that engineer did, Lawson, and what you did after coming down here fixing it, it matters to people like us. It matters that somebody told the truth and somebody else finally listened to it. Claire sat with that for a moment. I should have listened 4 weeks earlier. Yeah, Gerald said without cruelty. You should have. But you listened eventually. That counts for something. On her second to last day, Claire asked to meet with Andre one final time. He came to the facility at her request to the production floor, not the conference room, not the 38th floor. She was standing near the Line 7 entrance in the same sensible shoes, and she had a document folder under her arm. He shook her hand. You look different, he said. I've been on the floor for 2 weeks. I know. How does it feel? She thought about it honestly, the way she had been trying to think about things honestly for the past 90 days. Like I've been in a building my whole career, and I just found out there were entire floors I never visited. She paused. I can't decide if that's sad or just true. Both probably. She opened the folder. Inside was a contract, clean white pages, legal formatting, the kind of document that meant what it said. This is the independent review agreement. Harold and the board have approved it. Annual engagement, renewable, full technical access to every facility and production line, protected reporting authority. Mandatory executive response within 48 hours of any filed concern. She held it out. The fee structure is on page 3. Andre took the document. He turned to page 3. He looked at the number. He looked at her. This is considerably more than $450. Yes, it is. Did anyone question it? Harold Fitch told me to make sure it was sufficient. Patricia Huang said it was appropriate for the scope. The board approved it unanimously. She held his gaze. Nobody questioned the number, Andre. Not once. He looked at the contract for a moment. Then he took a pen from his shirt pocket, the same pen he'd capped and put away in that conference room 90 days ago, and he signed it on the line. He handed it back to her. One condition, he said. Name it. Naomi has full authority to act on any finding I report. Not advisory authority, operational authority. She can halt a line. She can hold a shipment, without needing to escalate to a committee. Already written in, Section 7. He nodded. Then we have a deal. She took the signed contract. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at him. I want to say something to you. Not as CEO. I'm not CEO anymore in about 36 hours. As a person. He waited. I've been thinking about what I said to you in that conference room. Not the words I know the words. I've replayed them enough. I mean what I was actually doing when I said them. She stopped, collected herself. I have spent 30 years in this industry earning authority. Building it piece by piece, proving myself in rooms where I wasn't expected to belong, making decisions that other people second-guessed because of how I looked walking through the door. I know what it is to be measured by something other than the quality of your work. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something. And then a man walked into my conference room, and I did to him exactly what had been done to me. I measured him by the number on his invoice, and the clothes on his back, and the fact that nobody had given him a title that told me in advance how seriously to take him. Andre was very still. I'm not telling you this because I want absolution. I don't think that's yours to give, and I don't think I've earned it. I'm telling you because I need to say it out loud to you specifically so that it's real, so that I carry it. She met his eyes. What I did in that room was wrong, not just the business decision, the human one. The production floor hummed steadily around them. Workers moved through the recoding process with the careful precision of people who understood that what they were doing mattered. The thermal validation monitors showed green, the real kind. I hear you, Andre said. And then because he was a man who believed in being precise, I forgive you. Not because it's easy, and not because it didn't cost me anything, but because carrying it would cost me more. He paused. Use it. What you learned here, what it cost. Use it wherever you go next. Claire's composure held but barely. She nodded once. I intend to. Her last day was quiet. She walked every floor of the facility, stopping to speak with people she had mostly known only by department name or headcount number. She stood at Diane's station and watched the recoding process run clean for 30 minutes. She found Gerald in the break room again and told him she'd recommended him for the floor supervisor position that was opening on line 4. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of someone deciding whether to trust good news. Why me? Because you told me the truth in this break room 2 weeks ago when you didn't have to. That's the quality I want in a supervisor. She paused. Raul Bennett agrees. Gerald looked at his coffee, then he looked up. Thank you. She found Raul at the end of the day in the small office overlooking the floor. He had been promoted 2 weeks prior to head Arden's newly independent safety division, a role that reported directly to the board, bypassing the standard executive chain with full authority to initiate production holds and external reviews. It was the role that Andre's final remediation report had specifically recommended, and Harold Fitch had moved on it within 72 hours of receiving the report. You're leaving tomorrow, Raul said. Yes. How are you feeling? She sat in the chair across from his desk, the plant manager's chair, small and functional, with a direct view through the window to the production floor. 11 years ago, I sat in an interview with Harold Fitch and told him that my goal was to build a company where the best decision was always the one that got made, not the easiest one, the best one. She looked at the floor below. I didn't build that. I built something that looked like it from the top. You built it now, Raul said. At least the foundation. Andre and Naomi and you built it. I just finally got out of the way. Raul looked at her. You know, when I first called Andre that Tuesday night, I wasn't sure he'd come. The money wasn't right for his experience level. The job was too small. I thought he might tell me to run a standard diagnostic and call him if I found something definitive. He paused. He came because he heard the words flight control units, and he took it seriously. That's the whole story right there. He took it seriously when it was still just a hunch and a vibration and $450. Claire looked at the floor below. I know, she said. I know that's the story. 1 year after the federal contract was terminated, Arden Aeronautics was awarded a new aerospace contract, smaller than $650 million, significantly smaller, but earned. The company had passed the most rigorous external safety audit in its history, conducted by an independent firm that had access to every internal record, every email thread, every production log from the previous 2 years. The audit had taken 11 weeks. It had found issues, smaller ones, process gaps, documentation inconsistencies, and Arden had addressed every single one before the audit was finalized. Naomi Pierce, now VP of Engineering Safety, had been the primary internal contact for the audit firm. She had given them everything they asked for and several things they hadn't thought to ask for. She had operated with the same methodical transparency that had made her walk a routing log to Rebecca Shaw's documentation team a year earlier, and the audit firm had noted in their final report that Arden's quality engineering leadership demonstrated an unusual and commendable commitment to full disclosure. Unusual and commendable. In the aerospace manufacturing industry, those two words appearing together in a federal audit report were worth more than their word count suggested. The new contract announcement came on a Wednesday morning. Naomi called Andre before she called anyone else. We got it. He was in his car driving to a client site, a different client, a different facility, a different set of problems that needed someone willing to look at them honestly. He pulled over. How big? 140 million 3-year engagement with a renewal option if the first phase delivers on spec. That's a good contract, Naomi. It's not $650 million. No, it's not. It's better. She was quiet for a moment. How is it better? Because you earned it clean. The $650 million that was built on a foundation that had a crack in it. This one's built on what you did after the crack showed. That's a different kind of foundation. He heard her exhale slowly. I've been thinking about something. A year ago, I was a senior quality engineer who had been told to discontinue her informal double-check protocol because it was unnecessary. Today, I'm the VP who can halt a production line. The distance between those two things is... She stopped. It's hard to put into words. You put yourself in that position, Andre said. You made the hard call when it mattered. Everything else followed from that. You made the first hard call. Raul made the first call. He picked up the phone on a Tuesday night when he was tired and scared, and his management was telling him he was chasing ghosts, and he trusted his gut enough to call someone who might tell him something he didn't want to hear. Start the story there. Naomi was quiet. How's your daughter? She asked finally. She's 10 now. She's been telling everyone at school that her dad is an engineer who saved a company. I keep telling her it was a team effort. She's not wrong. She's also not entirely right, but I'll take it. Naomi laughed, the kind that comes from the part of you that has been holding tension for a long time and suddenly doesn't have to anymore. Andre, the board wants to know if you'll renew the independent review agreement. Patricia and Harold both asked me to ask. Already renewed. I signed the renewal last week. You signed it before the contract announcement? Yes. You didn't know we'd gotten it. Didn't matter. The agreement isn't contingent on your contract status. It's contingent on whether you're still doing the work right, and you are. Another pause. Thank you. For everything. For the whole year. Go celebrate the contract with your team, he said. You earned it. 3 months after the new contract was announced, Andre Lawson opened the doors of Lawson Engineering Group, not a large firm. He had no interest in a large firm. 4 people, himself, an office manager named Sandra, who had been running his scheduling and billing since he went independent 8 years ago, a junior materials engineer named Kevin Park, who had reached out after reading about the Arden case in a trade publication, and a contracts attorney named Diane Torres, who had helped him structure the independent review model he'd developed during the Arden engagement. The office was in a converted warehouse space that had good light and room for equipment. The walls were bare, except for 3 things: a framed copy of his Air Force commendation, the photograph of Maya at her school play with the gap-toothed grin, and a single printed sentence mounted on plain white paper behind his desk. Expertise was never expensive. Ignoring it was. He had written that line in a text message to Claire Whitmore on the morning of her last day at Arden, when she had sent him a note that said simply, "Thank you for coming back when you had every reason not to." He had typed back the sentence without thinking about it, the way the truest things sometimes arrive fully formed because they have been true for so long that they don't require construction anymore. She had called him when she saw it. "Can I use that when I talk about this? It's the truth. Truth doesn't belong to anyone." She had used it. She had used it in the deposition that the federal investigation into Grant Mercer's conduct had required her to give. She had used it in the industry conference where she had been invited to speak about leadership accountability, a speech that had, from what Andre heard through Naomi, made several people in the audience visibly uncomfortable, and several others visibly relieved. She had used it in the conversation she had with her son, the structural engineer who had called her after reading the coverage of the Arden case and said quietly, "Mom, you should have listened to him the first time." To which she had said, I know I should have." Grant Mercer had settled the federal investigation without admitting liability under terms that were not public, with restrictions on future employment in federally contracted industries. He had not spoken publicly about the case. He had not returned to aerospace manufacturing. The line technician Marcus had been promoted to quality assurance coordinator. He still filed his concerns in writing, but now they went into a system with a mandatory 48-hour response window, and Naomi Pierce's office received a copy of everything automatically. Yolanda, the quality checker, who had developed her own informal double-check protocol and been told to discontinue it, had been formally recognized by Arden's safety division as having demonstrated exemplary professional judgment. Her informal protocol had been incorporated with her input into the company's new standard operating procedure. Raul Bennett had been offered a senior position at 2 other companies in the 18 months since the Arden story became known in the industry. He had turned both of them down. Why? Andre had asked him over coffee 6 months after the new contract was awarded. Because the job I have now is the job I should have had 15 years ago. Full authority over safety direct board access people who actually do what they say they're going to do. He looked at his coffee. It took a $650 million disaster to get here, but I'm here. That's worth something. It's worth a lot. Also, Raul had looked at him with a slight shift in his expression. Something between gratitude and something that didn't have a clean name. I called you, that Tuesday night. I didn't know if you'd come. I didn't know if anything would come of it. I just knew something was wrong, and I knew you were the right person to call. He paused. I need you to know that I don't take that for granted. That you came. I came because you called, Andre had said. And you called because you trusted yourself enough to know the problem was real. That's the part that matters, Raul. You trusted yourself. On a Tuesday evening, a full year and 2 weeks after the first Tuesday night phone call that had started everything, Andre was at his desk in the Lawson Engineering Group office when his cell phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Is this Andre Lawson, the materials engineer? The voice was younger than Raul's had been, tighter with anxiety. The voice of someone who had been running a problem around in their head for long enough that calling about it felt like a confession. Speaking. My name is Thomas Webb. I'm a plant supervisor at Meridian Dynamics. We're an aerospace components manufacturer in Ohio. I got your name from Dr. Osei at Meridian Technical Services. She said. He paused. She said if I had a problem that didn't make sense, and the automated systems were saying everything was fine, you were the person to call. Andre looked at the framed sentence on the wall behind his desk. He looked at the photograph of Maya. He picked up his notepad. Tell me what's not making sense, he said. The man on the other end of the line exhaled the exhale of someone who has been holding a difficult thing alone for too long and has finally found someone willing to share the weight of it. And Andre Lawson, who had driven to a factory at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night for $450 because he heard the words flight control units and understood what those words meant, opened his notebook to a fresh page and began to write. Because this was what he was for. This specific thing showing up when the problem was still a vibration, still a hunch, still something everybody else had decided was noise. Showing up before it cost anyone anything they couldn't afford to lose. Showing up with his work boots and his worn laptop bag and 31 years of knowing how to look at a thing and tell the truth about what he saw. The $450 had been paid. The $650 million was gone. The company had survived. The people had kept their jobs. The safety infrastructure had been rebuilt from the floor up. A 9-year-old girl had learned from watching her father that dignity is not something other people assign you. It is something you carry, regardless of what number someone puts next to your name. All of that was done. And this phone call, this new voice, this plant supervisor in Ohio who had trusted himself enough to know the problem was real, this was where the work continued. Andre had always known that integrity is not a single dramatic moment. It is not the walk out of the conference room, or the email sent at 3:00 a.m., or the samples delivered to an independent laboratory before anyone thought to stop them. Integrity is a practice. It is the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions made correctly, even when nobody is watching, even when the fee is small, even when the room is full of people who have already decided what your opinion is worth before you've opened your mouth. He had made those decisions his whole life. He would make them tomorrow, and the day after that,